minutes. So for those that don't know me, my name is Furey. I'm the director of the RWSN secretariat, and it's a real pleasure to be collaborating with the Water Integrity Network on a topic that's been core to RWSN now for many, many years, a couple of decades now. And you'll hear a lot today about the integrity implications of self-supply and what self-supply is, which is, in very short terms, it's households investing in their own water supplies, or groups of households, even communities sometimes, taking matters into their own hands, not waiting for someone else to come along and provide them with a safe, reliable water supply, but getting out there and either making it themselves or paying for someone to drill a borehole in their backyard, to fit a rainwater tank, all sorts of things that we'll hear about today. So anyway, so the running order of today is that we will have the main presentation by Alana Potter, and then we have a group of fantastic experts who I've known for many years, who really are that, along with Alana, sort of leading lights in the self-supply area. So we have Arto Suominen talking about the integrity of household managed water supplies in Finland. We have a recorded presentation from Tim Foster. Tim wanted to be here, but he's based at the University of Technology in Sydney. And this is not a great time for him in that time zone. So he sent us a great pre-record. We have Henk on the call today, and we hopefully will have Chola and Mbilima, who, yeah, we're having some connection issues, but hopefully she will join us later. So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Alana to get us going on this topic. And yeah, please tell us, what is this? What is self-supply and the integrity implications of it? Over to you.
All right, so really just to say thank you for the space for me to be here today, and I look forward to a rich and valuable discussion. Today I'm going to hone in on the linkages and disjuncts between the international human rights framework and self-supply. And I should be able to move to the next slide. There we go. So our water work at Equality Collective in the remote rural district in the Eastern Cape in South Africa is about building active citizenry and strengthening government-led services. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover a very brief overview and some framing before we get into the substance of self-supply and human rights. Because without water, we cannot live, communities step into the gaps where government provision is inadequate, unaffordable, or unreliable. And as Sean said, they independently develop, operate, or maintain water in their own water systems for domestic or for productive uses on a large or a small scale for part or all of the water infrastructure. And of course, there are very strong examples where self-supply is a conscious choice, and we'll hear more about them today. But in this overview, I define self-supply more widely to incorporate both thoughtful and supported models of self-supply, and the far more pervasive examples of communities doing it for themselves because public provision has failed for whatever reason, whether corruption, mismanagement, or discrimination, or a lack of prioritization to deliver water services. So self-provision is most prevalent in remote rural communities, hard to reach communities, informal settlements, not exclusively, but that's where it's most widespread. And it is without doubt at the same time a powerful expression of agency and self-sufficiency, and an invitation to co-creation, and for communities can be really costly and risky, and presents a really powerful opportunity for governments to co-create service provision if they constructively engage its energy and organizing. So, I mean, there are a mix in this particular slide of supported and unsupported self-supply, but I think it gives you the picture. Self-supply is widespread, and in some instances, the only way that communities can access services. There are many reasons we should be concerned with self-supply, and one of them is that it's often invisible and there's a clear call from communities for it to be seen and visibilized and supported. Together with Samavi, RWSN, OHCHR, Ungawa, Radio Del Agua, WIN, Coordganised, End Water Poverty gathered 114 different video testimonies from CBOs, community-based organizations, and water-defended groups in 18 different countries across the world, and later synthesized that into a policy brief. From these testimonies, two things are starkly clear. The one is that communities are taking action. And they cannot afford to wait for government to provide, and they devise and revise a range of creative rights-claiming strategies, including self-supply. The other is they often do this because they encounter discrimination and are left behind formal provision, sometimes deliberately, and this is particularly true in marginalized groups. Taken together, these testimonies really do set out, as is set out in the policy brief, three calls. The one is for meaningful engagement as legitimate participants and right holders. Then the need for better, two is the need for better accountability mechanisms and for essentially accountability from both state and non-state actors. And three, the recognition of what they're already doing to self-provide for states to build upon and provide support to. The second has to do, and I think there are many other reasons, but another one is the business case, which I'm sure Henk will elaborate on in his presentation. There are countless examples of self-supply all over the world. Some are documented in Sally Satin and John Butterworth's premiere on self-supply, filling the gaps in public water supply provision from Thailand, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Zambia, Scotland, the Danube region, as well as Ghana and Mexico, come up in a lot of RWSN reports and research. So what are some of the opportunities and costs of self-supply? The drawbacks of self-supply are significant. Inequality may widen where groups cannot afford to invest in their own systems, or where decision-making is dominated by powerful or influential groups and individuals, both within and outside of communities. Clearly, abstracting from unsafe sources severely compromises health and well-being, and addressing water quality issues is paramount. If unregulated, more powerful users, including large-scale agricultural users, property developers, business users, can be massively detrimental to self-supply systems. And self-supply, unsupported self-supply in particular, is often invisible. And so there's little information available to enable better management and accountability, for example, on groundwater abstraction costs or accessibility. At the same time, and with strong provisos in place, self-supply presents several very strong opportunities. It reduces reliable provision. Because self-supply is community managed, it's more likely to be locally appropriate and cost sufficient, improve flexibility and resilience, and address water for multiple uses. Leveraging local resources, knowledge, and investments by households can improve the longevity of infrastructure, and that I think is well documented. And self-supply can also meet aspirations for higher levels of service, where basic service levels don't meet human rights standards of accessibility, affordability, or acceptability. And now on to really the kind of main thrust of the presentation. When we talk about human rights, what are we talking about? And essentially, human rights are a legal, universally acknowledged normative framework of rights and freedoms inherent to anyone, regardless of their nationality, gender, religion, or any other status or identity. So implicit in that is the idea that essentially the principle that equality and non-discrimination is the bedrock of the human rights framework. Human rights provide a normative framework for minimum standards and principles against which accountability can be held of public and private actors in courts, through advocacy, through research, through monitoring, through advocacy, and through the media. So essentially, in terms of a range of international declarations to which hundreds of countries have signed up, the rights of access to water and sanitation is a human right? And several of these declarations are set out there in dark blue. Progressive realization means that the normative rights to water and sanitation may be reached incrementally, okay, progressively, but states must allocate and use maximum available resources to improve access to water. And this may include diverting resources, both human and financial, from other efforts in order to do this. So what then are the human rights to water and sanitation? This is a slide that the former UN Special Rapporteur presented in a former RWSN webinar, but the UN General Assembly and the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights set out the status and legal content of water and sanitation as human rights defined here. And I'm not going to go into that. A lot of this should be quite familiar to people. These human rights standards, which is also called a normative framework, and the definitions on the previous slide were essentially developed across this framework of availability, quality, accessibility, affordability, and acceptability. And these same parameters are used to essentially set standards for a range of socioeconomic rights, including the right to a safe environment, to adequate housing, sanitation, health, social security, and others. But as we dive into looking at how self-supply and human rights can intersect, it's important to keep these realities in mind. The first is the challenge, the scale of the challenge for safe water and sanitation. And the other is around the pace of progress. So the WHO UNICEF JMP program sets out both the kind of the numbers of people lacking access to safe water and sanitation, but also estimates that the pace of progress in low-income countries would need to be multiplied 20-fold for us to meet the SDGs for water, sanitation, and hygiene. The other point is that because the human rights framework for water and sanitation focuses on domestic water, what it doesn't adequately do is support water for small-scale agricultural use, and so it muddles the relationship between water resources and water services. And so we often see other more powerful actors taking more than their fair share of water, depriving communities, smallholders, pastoralists, etc., of water for livestock, irrigation, and also for domestic use. So digging a bit deeper, as others like the former UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation said, supported self-supply can provide a really pragmatic mechanism for progressive realization to the rights to water and sanitation. But important also to note that because human rights, all of these different human rights are indivisible and independent, the right to support water for livelihoods can be derived from intersecting rights to food, water, to food, health, and life, right? And this is spelled out really clearly in the current UN Special Rapporteur's special report recently released on the water-food nexus. So I think it's important just to keep these things in mind. So when we pull the bits and pieces together, what can we actually say? And this is really the kind of thrust of the point. So, I mean, just as a framing point in terms of international human rights law, as we said, states are obliged to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And in the first instance, according to the General Comment 15 of the OHCHR, the obligation to respect the human rights to water and sanitation means that states may not interfere with or curtail the enjoyment of these rights. And so the state cannot prevent residents from accessing where there's no safe, affordable, or acceptable water. They cannot prevent people from self-providing. Neither can they arbitrarily cut off their water. So in the first instance, self-supply is protected under the obligation on states to respect the right to water and sanitation. In terms of protecting the obligation to protect the human rights to water and sanitation, this really requires that states prevent third parties, including private actors, from interfering with the enjoyment of these rights in any way. So in the first instance, the obligation to respect means that governments may not interfere where self-provision is underway. In the second instance, to progressively realize the right to water, the government of any country is obliged to take deliberate, concrete, and targeted steps to ensure that everyone can access safe, affordable, and acceptable water services wherever they live and however the service is provided. They must take steps using maximum available resources to provide water service to everyone. So in the second instance, we need to see concrete, clear, and deliberate steps to progressive realization. In the third instance, and this is really important, human rights principles must be applied in any state endeavor to realize rights, including the rights to water and sanitation. And these principles include equality and non-discrimination, participation, access to information and transparency, accountability, and sustainability or non-retrogression. So in the third instance then, however states choose to progressively realize the right to water, their interventions must be undertaken in line with these principles. And this is obviously especially important with respect to safeguarding the rights of marginalized groups, many of whom are self-providing. Important also to note the overlap between the human rights principles and the pillars of water integrity, participation, accountability, transparency, and access to information. As I said earlier, equality and non-discrimination are the bedrock principles of human rights law. And this principle alone speaks to the need for supported self-supply at the bare minimum. We don't live in a fair world, and there are profound power asymmetries along the fault lines of race, class, gender, geography, and they're often held in place by discriminatory practices. And what this means in order to kind of implement the principle of equality and non-discrimination is that states must take active and affirmative measures to provide differentiated support and to eliminate the conditions that cause or perpetuate discrimination. So the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights in a participatory, accountable, and non-discriminatory way is a duty not like progressive realization, but it's a duty that is immediately binding on states. They need to do this immediately. They can't incrementally fulfill the roles of their obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill. And then the fourth and final obligation in the intersection is the obligation on states to fulfill the human rights to water and sanitation. And this requires that states ensure access to water and sanitation and create an enabling policy and regulatory environment. And this includes, for progressive realizations, the right to water for health and for food. The components of ensure I'm setting out in the role of government in the next few slides. So what then is the role of government? And I've picked out 5 pieces here. The first has to do with creating an enabling legal and regulatory framework. And this means recognizing supported self-supply in policies, guidelines, and bylaws. And some examples of this could include recognizing community-based organizations as legal entities, recognizing water for small-scale productive use, and doing better to enforce regulations on large-scale users and corporates that abstract and pollute water sources that downstream communities rely on. The second important component of ensure is finance, to creatively provide financial support for self-supply, and several mechanisms are included here, which could include, smart subsidies, particular kind of support to vulnerable groups, prioritizing affordable technologies, and importantly, quantifying and recognizing the costs of self-supply, which, as we said earlier, may be financially effective, but can come at high economic costs for communities. The third component of ensure has to do with planning, intersectoral and inclusive planning. And here states need to put communities at the forefront of decisions around planning and infrastructure development for supported self-supply, because communities are best placed to determine the systems that they can sustain with support. And so recognizing and building on self-supply efforts and local expertise. Inclusive planning also helps to prevent elite capture within communities, and really important that any kinds of planning for different initiatives in self-supply and broader water planning is intersectional and intersectoral with sanitation, electricity, roads, land use management, housing, and so on. And then 4 and 5, for technical support, provide technical support and guidance to households and community-based organizations for example, around contextually appropriate technical solutions, supporting training for spring protection, safely managing wells, managing water quality, etc. So really also supporting upgrading of various water supply systems. And secondly, advancing technologies, manufacturing and selling affordable pumps, solar pumps, manual drilling, storage tanks, household treatment, etc. And in the 5th instance, collaborating with communities to ensure safe and secure access to water via self-supply. So this includes supporting water quality monitoring, construction standards, ensuring that they stay in place and are monitored, surface and groundwater availability, as well as monitoring the pollution and abstraction by other actors. In conclusion then, Without support, self-supply places communities at significant risk, especially given climate change impacts on the environment and economies. Community-driven supported self-supply is one approach to achieve universal access and strengthen community resilience, can play a vital role in progressive realization, but government must be held accountable for their obligations. And these obligations are very clearly spelled out in the human rights framework. And self-supply in no way abnegates them from these responsibilities, including to provide vulnerable communities with the required assistance to make supported self-supply real and sustainable. Well-targeted support to enable communities to realize their rights to water, food, and life is not negotiable, and it requires relationships and actions built on trust and guided by human rights and integrity principles. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't run too long.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alana. That was super clear. Really great points. I agree with all of that, and some good level of nuance on there as well. So just if you have any questions on any of the presentations that we've got coming up, please use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, or whatever your interface you're using. So yeah, please put your questions in there. The speakers will probably answer them directly in the chat box, but those that are more interesting will probably bring up in the discussion a bit later. But anyway, okay, so next we are going to move to our next speaker, Arto Suominen, who I've known for many years. He's done a lot of work in Ethiopia, but I believe, Arto, you're going to be talking to us about Finland.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so happy to have an opportunity to give this presentation, especially in this forum. And it is so nice to see that many people I know are participating. And you have maybe noticed that I have used the word household managed water supply instead of self-supply, because that's the way how we call it here in Finland. Okay, next slide. Let's see why self-supply in Finland is special. We have many lakes, 170,000, and they are really our natural resource. Water in the lakes is quite good quality, but it's not drinkable. During the winter, also the temperature goes down to -30, -40 Celsius, and pipes get easily frozen. In the rural area, the population density is about 10 people per square kilometer, and in the north, it goes more down. Houses are kilometers from each other. And the government is not accountable to provide water supply service to the houses which are not inside the defined operational area of the pipe water systems. Next one. The water supply is serving less than 50 households, or water is used less than 10 meter cube per day. In that case, it's considered as a self-supply. Groundwater in Finland is available almost everywhere, and the groundwater table is very shallow. Today, only 8 to 10% from the total population is using self-supply in Finland. But when we go to the rural areas, the figure is 50 to 70% from the rural population is using self-supply. Government is not responsible to keep data on self-supply, and due to this, we do not have data on the safely managed water supply for the JMP reporting, as you can see in the picture. Next one. Some 70 years ago, more than half of the Finland population, mainly women, carried water to home from the wells. 90 to 90% access to pipe water supply service was achieved in 50 years. But the last 25 years, the access has remained the same. This finding is very important because every country should accept the fact that pipe water supply service cannot reach all, and therefore self-supply service delivery model should be part of the water supply access planning. So that's what we have learned. Now, next slide. Water supply support and monitoring is split between the authorities of health, construction, and environment. Households in rural areas have right to build the well on their yard and use the groundwater for domestic use free. Health authority is dealing with households only if the water is causing health hazards. Okay, next one. District is responsible for water management planning. Self-supply development is not part of the district planning process. It focuses only on pipe water. Many households have renewed their water supply. Old functions as a reserve, and the new one is in use, like you can maybe see in this picture. Opinion surveys reveal that self-supply users are happy with their systems and the water they drink. They do not want to be connected to the pipe water systems, and they do not want any regulation from the government. Next one. Self-supply information and guidelines are freely available on the internet, but not easily found. Population in rural areas is decreasing at the moment, and the age of the self-supply users are getting older. Young generation is moving to the towns. Elders want personal contacts and information in hard copies, not internet. And this is becoming a challenge. Okay, next one. Groundwater protection areas are well mapped and information is available. If your house is on the protection area, strict regulations are to be followed. You can construct self-supply system with 50 to 20% on the average annual income of 48,000 euros. The annual income of many elderly people living in rural areas is less than the average. Financial assistance from the government is available only in very special cases. Next one. Electricity is available almost everywhere. This facilitates the use of technology in water treatment. Private sector for self-supply is available and are actively promoting their solutions. In the past, some suppliers sold unnecessary products to the elderly house owners. Today, the situation is better. Water testing laboratories are everywhere available, but people are not actively testing their water if good quality water was found during the construction or rehabilitation. Water quality testing is recommended every 3 years, and it is on the cost of the owner. And one set of tests can cost 300 to 400 euros. Thank you so much. I hope this ignited some discussions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Arto. So there was a lot packed into that short presentation. There's really interesting things that hopefully we'll unpack in the discussion. I think for me, one of the important things is that quite often within RWSN, we've talked about self-supply as being a failure in something that is widespread, particularly within low-income countries, but actually it's in every country. So it's every government needs to have some form of self-supply support, maybe not Singapore, but everywhere else that has a rural area where you have a dispersed rural population, isolated homesteads, farmsteads, there will be self-supply no matter how rich the country is, and therefore there needs to be some level of support. And I thought your point interestingly about aging rural population as well, and what the implications of access to information and things like that. That I thought that was a really good insight. Great. So let's move to the next one, which I believe is the pre-record from Tim. So perhaps I could ask that to be set up, and off we go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Foster from the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. Together with Diana Gonzalez, we've been working on self-supply issues in Asia and the Pacific over the last 6 years. And today I'm going to share some of what we've learned about self-supply across the region. And this work is based on extensive analysis of more than 80 national data sets across 21 countries. So over the next 5 or 6 minutes, I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour across 3 areas. Firstly, prevalence of self-supply. Secondly, equity aspects of self-supply. Thirdly, the service levels provided by self-supply. And then fourthly, the policy aspects of self-supply. So as I mentioned, this work covers 21 countries across Asia and the Pacific, has analysed a range of different data sets, has reviewed policies, strategies, guidelines from across the region. And all throughout, we've defined self-supply as a groundwater source or a rainwater source that is located on the premises of a household. So starting off with prevalence. So how widespread is self-supply? Well, it turns out it's incredibly common. So roughly 1/3 of all households in Asia and the Pacific self-supply their drinking water. So that's about 800 million people relying on these sources. About 40%, almost 40% of the rural population use self-supply, and a touch over 20% of the urban population use self-supply. The types and forms of self-supply vary across the region. So in the Pacific, it's mainly in the form of rainwater tanks. In Asia, it's groundwater sources, particularly private tube wells in South Asia, and also to a lesser extent, private dug wells. Self-supply is not static in the region too. It's growing by about 10 million people every year are adopting self-supply. So it's on the rise. Now on to equity aspects. So one of the interesting things about the equity aspects of self-supply is that there's a lot of variation across the region. There's no consistent story. So in some countries, it's primarily the better off households that self-supply, perhaps because they can they're able to afford the investment that's needed to get a private well or rainwater tank on the premises. Sometimes it's the poorest households that are more likely to use self-supply. So here we have the Maldives, where the poorest quintile is substantially more likely to use self-supply than the wealthiest quintile. But then there are many countries where it's the middle wealth quintiles that are most likely to use self-supply. So it really does vary from country to country. Now moving on to service levels. So interestingly, self-supply systems are often more reliable than piped supplies, especially in rural areas where piped water is intermittent. But as you can see from this graph, where the blue dots are self-supply, the yellow dots are piped water, the y-axis is the percentage of sources where water was always sufficient in the last month or 2 weeks. You can see that in most countries, self-supply is more reliable than pipe supply. But of course, reliability isn't the whole story. Water quality can be a concern and is often the foremost concern when it comes to self-supply. And as many people would expect, in many countries, pipe supply provides water that is safer than self-supply. But it's not always the case. So the y-axis here is the percentage of sources that are free from E. coli. So we have 3 countries here, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, all countries with a lot of self-supply, where self-supply actually provides water that is more likely to be free from E. coli than pipe supply. So again, it's variation from country to country. Arsenic is also obviously an issue in parts of Asia. And what we see is in where we have data in Bangladesh and Nepal, pipe supplies are more likely to provide water that is safe in terms of arsenic content. Vietnam, conversely so. So when we put all these things together to get a sense of safely managed services, what we find is, again, a mixed picture. In some countries, on the left with the blue box, we have self-supply being more likely to provide a safely managed service than pipe supply. But there are also other countries, for example, the orange box on the right side, where pipe supply is more likely to provide a safely managed service. In terms of policy, we looked at this from a number of different angles, including regulation, direct support, monitoring, and broader policy framework. And what we found generally is that very few countries, and there are very few instances of genuine policy engagement with self-supply. Sometimes it's acknowledged, but only in a very cursory way. We did find some examples, however. I'll note two here. Firstly, Fiji on the left-hand side, where there has been a government-funded program to subsidise rainwater tanks for households. Another example is in Vietnam, where there's been quite clear policy support for self-supply in areas where pipe sources or pipe supplies are absent. So, what does this all mean? Well, self-supply is widespread, growing, and in many cases delivering a service that is equal to other service models, but it remains underappreciated and ignored by policy. But what's clear is that households have made enormous investment in self-supply. And if we're serious about SDG 6, we need to recognise this and identify the opportunities and harness those, but also be very clear about the risks and manage and mitigate those risks. So in case you want to delve a little deeper, we've developed 21 country fact sheets, which go into a lot of detail in terms of the analysis, and you can use the QR code to access those. And we'd very much welcome you to reach out. We'd love to have a chat with anyone who wants to talk about self-supply in the region. And thank you very much for listening to the presentation.
Fantastic. Another very clear and concise presentation. I think two things that I would take away from that. One is the scale of self-supply in this region. It's I was speaking to a funder in Uganda a few weeks ago, and he was saying, self-supply, it's not a big deal. There's not much of it around. Oh yes, there is. And so I think that's one important, just the scale of it. The other thing from Tim's presentation there is how, isn't it interesting that in some contexts, it's the rich people that self-supply and the poorest are on a government or whatever official provided scheme. And in other cases, it's the poorest that self-supply, and because the richest have access to a good service. So, yeah. So there's all sorts of, it goes back to a point Alana made about inequality and the role of inequality in this. So that's one of the reasons why self-supply is kind of somehow a difficult one to say it's good, it's bad, because it's different. Anyway, let's move on to our next presenter, who many of you will know, Henk Holtslag, who's been doing so much. He's like a world authority on self-supply over many years and decades, and I'm sure we will Henk, off to you, sir, and give us your pearls of wisdom.
Thanks a lot for the nice introduction. I hope I'm not the expert, because we should have many experts. I'd like to share some experiences on especially supported self-supply in Africa. And the focus of this presentation is on the human rights. Do you see my screen, by the way? Yeah. So if we talk about, what do we talk about? Three aspects: the quality, volume, and availability are the most important parts. And about water quality in urban areas, if you have pipe systems, it's called safely managed, and the indicator is at premises, available 24/7 and safe. So according to UNICEF, there's not 39% of the people in Africa have safely managed, but in reality, it is probably almost none of what the companies can guarantee always safe drinking water from the tap. In rural areas, if supply is with hand pumps, there is another problem. Studies indicate that even if water is safe at the point of tap, over 75% of the water is recontaminated in the transport or the storage at the household level. So in short, pipe systems or tap points don't guarantee safe water at the point of use. And the solution is household water treatment, as is promoted by the World Health Organization. And of all these options, the filters are the most effective, and that is due to their consistent use. And all rich families in many countries use them. For instance, in United States, 95% of the families use a filter. In India, that is 50%, but Africa is lagging behind. So the challenge is to get this rich man solution to the poor. And we see that is possible with 3 actions, which is awareness, supply chain, and targeted subsidies for the poor. There is a United Nations commitment called 2 with 8, which means safe water for 2 billion people at an investment of $8 billion. So in rural areas where pipe systems are too expensive, we have basic service, which is an indicator improved water source within 30 minutes walking from home. And we all know the problems in rural Africa. 25% or more of the points are not functioning due to lack of funds or failing business models. There is another reason also, but over 300 million people lack basic service. And a solution there can be supporting self-supply, which in our case means that we use low-cost technologies. If we use wells, it is shared with 5 to 10 families, and the focus on productive use. So there is money for the pump maintenance. Now, in many rural areas in Africa, there is less than 125 persons in a radius of 1 kilometer. So to provide basic service for those 300 million people with the conventional approach would have cost at least $16 billion. Now, if we use the supported self-supply model, as I mentioned, the cost would only be $8 billion. And I give you some examples. In Zambia, the organization Yakana had subsidies for 600 wells, and a well that serves 40 people costs $1,000, so that is $25 per person. The results are that over 90% of these pumps are functioning, but there is also demand creation. So over 300 families paid the pump themselves. In Tanzania, an aid fund of $1 million was used for training and subsidies for 700 wells and pumps, and now there is over 15,000 row pumps, and 80% is paid for by families, so 100% self-supply. In Nicaragua, there's 50,000 row pumps installed at farm families, and together these families generated over $100 million in the last 20 years, and all this started with $2 million of aid money for training. So self-supply is only possible if you have affordable technology. And a range of those technologies are called smart techs. There's no time to go into detail, but it is wells starting at $200. There is pumps starting at $40. There is filters starting at $20. And smart techs are not small in numbers. There is huge numbers at the moment. There's over 5 million filters. There's over 200,000 hand-drilled wells, and there is over 200,000 locally produced pumps like Amos pumps and rope pumps. And the key for success is besides the market-based thing, is the ownership. If a well is owned by a family, they take care for it. So rather than the community. Also, key is profit. If water generates income, there is money for the pump maintenance. And all this requires building local capacity. Because a hard lesson learned in the past 30 years is, although a rope pump looks simple, simple is not easy. And that goes for both the technical, the business, and the social aspects. On the right hand, you see a rope pump. 200 of these pumps were installed in Ghana. In 1 year, 80% was broken. So the effects of supported self-supply is the basic service at an average of $25 per person on the condition that it's 200 millimeters of rain per year. But it's also a smart way of doing, because it can reduce the funds of governments and NGOs that they have or they should have to reach SDG 6 in rural areas. And we solve the eternal headache of pump functionality. And it was mentioned already, there's other effects of self-supply on poverty and food, on gender, the human right, jobs and work, and climate. If you combine rainwater harvesting and infiltration technologies like the tube recharge or breaking hardpan, you can infiltrate all the water, and then you have more water to pump up. There's also aspects on transparency and corruption. Household water systems and locally produced technologies are less prone to corruption. So I have two propositions that maybe fit for the discussion later on. The one is that supporting self-supply can reduce the cost and increase the pump functionality and impact on the poverty and other SDGs. So would you agree with this impact? And if so, what are your ideas to scale up? And if you don't agree, what are the reasons? And the second proposition is those that have basic service, they had a subsidy of at least $25 per person for the CAPEX. So those who lack basic service have the same right to the same subsidy. And we could even make that subsidy a human right. So the question is, would you agree or would you disagree? And if you disagree, what are then the reasons? Thanks a lot for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Henk. So the financial implications are there, I think, for governments, but also for households, the money that they put in, but also the monies that they can earn from multiple use of water from livestock. So that sort of livestock, that livelihood component of rural water supply is really important as well. Now, we have one final speaker on the agenda, Chola, but is she with us? Do you know?
Chola, are you there?
Yes, I'm
Okay.
here.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent. Lovely. Great. Well, thank you for your patience. So our last speaker is going to talk to us about how supported self-supply has been recognized in policies and regulations, I believe in Kenya. So off you go, please.
Thank you so much. And just a correction there, it's in Zambia.
Oh, Zambia, sorry.
Yeah, just move to the next slide, please. Okay, so I would like to start us off with an African proverb that just talks about a village. Now, we've heard from the different speakers, and it's good that I was the last one because I've picked up a few things from the other speakers. But one of the things that came out quite significantly was that, of course, we cannot do away with self-supply systems. These are very important. They are integral because they come in to cover a gap. And we are all striving towards attaining SDGs. And by doing that, I'm sure we need to embark on some pragmatic measures that can allow us as countries to progress towards these SDGs. So these systems do not come from without. They actually come in to fill a gap that is existing somewhere. But in the African proverb setup, there is a proverb that goes, a village that has no rules has no integrity. So a number of these self-supply systems, but we need rules for them to be able to actually operate effectively. So next slide, please. Some of the risks that we've seen from an integrity point of view, and I'm speaking to these even from the experience of Zambia, is that sometimes there's quite some exploitation with these self-supply systems. You realize that the community is dependent on them. They might actually, exploit them, especially for the vulnerable, the girls, the children. So sometimes that becomes an integrity risk on the part of these self-supply systems. The other issue is that normally they lack service levels because there's no one to really govern them. Remember, they come up to fill a gap. So they will provide services in the best way they feel is correct. But they will, in most cases, not have the standard service levels that they can be held accountable to. And in some instances, they also tend to overprice. And this is something that we've experienced in the peri-urbans of Zambia, where because they know they're the only ones and everybody's relying on them, so they tend to overprice their services. And in some instances, the prices are even higher than the utility service provider. Other instances, there's bribery. When you need to get a connection, for example, you need to get a supply from this self-system, you have to bribe somebody. So those are potential risks that lie with these self-supply systems. Issues of redress mechanisms are not very well defined. So if you are not happy with the services, where do you go? Because this is a community that's just coming to help. So how do you deal with issues that you are confronted with? And then, of course, who are they accountable to? Because I can imagine that if they come up to fill a gap, they're trying to help out, quite all right and well appreciated. But if something does not work well, can they be held accountable? And in our context at Zambia, we have seen that this is not possible because they will be saying, look, we came in to help. So if there's a problem, let the government sort it out. So sometimes those are the risks that you face from an integrity point of view. Next slide. So with all those potential risks in integrity, what we are saying is that we should not kill these initiatives of self-supply, but rather put up systems that will allow them to operate and be able to deal with those integrity risks. So in our context as Zambia, what we've done is that we've created a governance structure that supports these self-supply systems so that they're able to operate effectively. So at the ministry, at the government level, we want them to create an enabling environment for these to operate. And this is what we've done through the policies and the legal framework, such that they have a legal mandate to do what they're doing, and they can also be supported by policy. So the government must basically recognize them. And when we say recognizing them, it's not just by word of mouth, but it should be documented somewhere so that we are able to fall back on that and say, this is what we're talking about. Then on the regulatory point of view, and I come from the regulator NWASCO, what we've done is that we need to enhance the accountability mechanisms for these systems. And what we've done is that we've created a framework that clearly recognizes them as part of the institutional arrangements that are there to provide services, be it water or sanitation. So the regulator then creates a framework that is able to, bring in that accountability in the process of service provision. Then, of course, as a utility, what we've done is that utilities are the service providers that are mandated generally. But because they cannot manage to provide services everywhere and they need the help of these initiatives, what we've done is that we have made it possible that the utility can just be the umbrella institution to be responsible overall, but the self-supply systems can then work under this umbrella to be able to have that responsibility channel well established. So the utility has an oversight on what these self-supply systems are doing, but they are allowed to operate in their own space. Next slide, please. So basically, that just shows the institutional arrangement that I've just explained. So in the urban areas, we do have self-supply systems, particularly in the peri-urban areas, but they work under the umbrella of the utility in whatever area that they are operating in. Equally, in the rural areas, we have a number of these self-supply systems, mainly in growth centers, what we call growth centers, but also they will operate under an umbrella of a service provider that is established, so that there's that oversight that is provided on their operations. And this also helps to bring in the support. Next slide, please. It also helps to bring in the support because self-supply systems, like we have pointed out in the other presentations, they need quite some support. So for example, if you look at issues of water quality, they may not have all the technical expertise to deal with such issues. So this umbrella institution is the one that is going to provide that technical support. It can even be financial support. Sometimes in our cases, we've seen that maybe they have a huge breakdown of their system and they don't have enough resources to repair it. So the utility that is the one that is responsible and providing the oversight support should be able to look into that issue and see how they can support these self-supply systems. So to conclude, what I would say is that self-supply systems are important. We cannot do away with them, but we need to make sure that the issues of integrity are upheld as they operate. And to do that, we need to make sure that clear accountability channels are created so that we are able to hold each other accountable in this area of service provision. We need to promote partnerships. So the service providers that are mandated should be able to create formal partnerships with these self-supply institutions. It can be maybe a community-based institution or even a private operator. They should be able to create those formalized partnerships, and that is something that we've done in our case. So they sign maybe an agreement or a contract that can just stipulate the relationship that they're sharing. Then, of course, I mentioned that there's need for support. So the oversight institutions must offer support about sustainability issues. How sustainable are these institutions going to be if they are left to run on their own? And finally, we need to look into service delivery models. What service delivery models have been established that will allow for integrity, but also a sustainable service provision to everybody. So thank you so much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, fantastic. Madam Mbilima, that was a fantastic presentation. I think that was so clear, and I think illustrated so many of the issues that came up in the other presentations. And so I think that was fantastic that you came at the end there, because I think the what I take from what you've said and how it links back to the other presentations is this issue over clarity and accountability, and who is responsible for doing what, how much responsibility rests on the shoulders of the individual and the individual household versus what's the responsibility of government and parastatal organizations such as yours. And I think that has to be a negotiated position for each context, because each context, they're going to have different cultural views, different economic circumstances in terms of whose job is it to bear the burden. So thank you so much for that, and there's also appreciation in the chat. So thank you so much for that. So we've got about 20 minutes left until we wrap up. There's already been a lot of exchange in the chat, which is fantastic. Thank you so much, and a lot of great questions coming up. So let's just have a look at some of the questions and see what's come up. So Alana, you've said that you'd like to answer the question live that's come up from AKM Ibrahim, which is, should the government promote self-service? I think the government will support self-services with the aim to reduce it and expand the government utility-led water supply. Am I correct?
Yeah. I actually wanted to respond to that in the chat and hit live by mistake, but
Oh.
I think that's I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, I think that as long as it's a conscious and supported decision, I think ultimately self-supply can be seen potentially as part of incremental progressive realization, but cannot be a regression. And needs to be sustainable and supported. So I think that's correct. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and on that that's an important point about regression as well. The way that Sally Sutton has often presented in her papers and books in the past about self-supply as being a series of steps of people moving up the service ladder, so incremental improvement in line with the socioeconomic circumstance of the individual, but also the area. But I think where we see the most damaging self-supply tends to be in urban areas where you have a decaying service. The most extreme that I've come across is Jakarta in Indonesia, where because the city water supply is so poorly managed that many buildings, businesses, homes have their own private boreholes in the city, and that's causing the entire city to sink, which is part of the reason why Indonesia is moving their capital city to another island. So that's probably the most extreme case of self-supply being a bad thing, but that's almost a kind of a feedback loop with the poor municipal service, because when private supplies deprive the municipal service of revenue, then you can kind of end up in a bit of a downward spiral. Okay, what other questions do we have? There's the water quality one always comes up. Who would like to speak to this in terms of, yeah, Henk, because I know there's always a tension here between like water quality and convenience in previous discussions, but when it comes to responsibilities and like government responsibility, what's the best way forward?
Yes, as you saw, the water quality issue is always coming up, because who is going to control the quality of household water level, household wells, for instance? And the answer, what would be the answer? Who is going to control?
The government.
Nobody. It's clear. I mean, there is not even money to control the communal wells, let alone that they're going to control the family wells. And you saw from the presentation from Arto that people don't even want the government to be involved. Let's be practical. And there is a solution. The household water treatment, and especially filters, there is a range of household water filters nowadays that are effective and can take out basically all the contaminants that are in any well. So if you combine self-supply automatically with water treatment, boiling, chlorine, or filters, you don't need to worry about the quality of a household well. Even if it is besides the latrine, you can treat the 4 liters of water per day per person with a filter. The challenge now is to build up supply chains of filters. That is where the big challenge is for governments and NGOs. Let's build up and make sure that there is water filters available in every village and every city, so people can buy the filters, and if needed, we can help the poorest with a subsidy. But the water filters and treatment at the household level is the solution for the water quality issue.
Mm-hmm. Chola, can I come to you from the NWASCO point of view? What's your perspective on household water treatment and the role of your organization in regulating that, or just stepping back and letting it just play out?
Well, I think that it's the responsibility of government still, ultimately, because I'll give a practical example of what happened in Zambia a few months ago when we had, contamination of water, in people's individual wells. At the end of the day, it became a government crisis because the government had to come in and now deal with the public health issues and implications that arose. So ultimately, I think that government should ensure that there is a mechanism that somehow looks into the quality of water that households use, whether by making sure that the institutions that they have created have an arm in overseeing that process, or ensuring that whoever has been given the responsibility in those areas is actually taking care of that particular aspect. So in our context as NWASCO, what we've done is that we have, like I had indicated earlier, given the utility that oversight function. So the utility has, from time to time, has to go and check what's going on with the water quality of the residents within its area of jurisdiction, even if it is not the one that is directly providing the service. So that is how we're dealing with it ourselves. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And is on the if so, household water filters are a like a consumer product that people can buy from a store or a shop. Is there any like regulation by another bit of the government in Zambia that does is regulating that as a consumer product?
Well, no, that they can buy. A household, if it can afford to do that, they can buy that gadget. But again, it all depends on what quality are we talking about? What are the parameters are we looking at? So in some instances, those gadgets would focus on the common issues like, the bacteria and things like that. But in our context, we have sometimes been confronted with issues of manganese in water, of high contents of copper in water, of iron in water. So that is not potable water, and people cannot drink such water. But you find that generally on the market, you won't get gadgets that will be able to treat that. If you find them, then probably they'll be too expensive for the individual households to be able to afford.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Alana, yeah, over to you.
Thanks very much. I mean, I just wanted to sort of problematize the notion that that water quality management rolls entirely onto households. And it's one of the reasons that I raised the issue of the role of government in regulating and managing water quality, right? And managing upstream polluters, how important that is. And to monitor water quality and make sure that very clear information is provided, and to support household water treatment. It can be quite an expensive endeavor, and exactly as Chola has said, may be beyond the reach of households to disinfect and ensure quality water.
Henk. And then we'll move on to the next topic.
Yes, well, this issue of water quality is a very important one. And I agree with Chola that the government somehow is responsibility. And some governments do take it already. There is now the example from Ethiopia where over 70 utilities who admit more or less that they cannot always deliver safe drinking water from the tap because power cuts, sharing water, etc. They sell now filters as an additional service. And I think Ethiopia should become an example because this is the reality in many countries in Africa. You cannot guarantee safe water all the time. So why not take the responsibility and say, at least promote together with the Ministry of Health, promote household water treatment, the same as hand washing, the same as sanitation, the same as hygiene. Water treatment should be considered exactly the same as any other intervention like hand washing and hygiene. So let's be realistic and start treating water at the household level in all the situations where you're not 100% sure you have safe drinking water.
Great, thank you. So moving on, that kind of moves me on to the next point that was raised in one of the questions from an anonymous attendee about self-supply. CLTS, which is community-led total sanitation, was popular and cheap with international organizations and governments as it removed the pressure to deliver and to pay. It was rife with human rights abuses, and linked to that was a previous point about what is community. We have evidence of how power dynamics means that this is a false concept. So is there anything that we can learn from CLTS as an approach, or other approaches that have tried to encourage action at the household level with or without subsidies, and what that means in terms of power dynamics and the inequalities that somehow spring out from that? Maybe Alana, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll certainly take a shot. I mean, I think we learned from community-led total sanitation that we cannot entirely roll on the pressure for sanitation delivery to households, right? That households needed support with rebuilding, with upgrading, with moving to next steps. That it wasn't just a behavioral issue, that technical support, construction support, subsidy support, etc., is required for sustainable sanitation service delivery. So yeah, I think that's a clear lesson from CLTS, and I'm very glad the person raised it.
Yeah. Yeah, Henk again. And then Arto.
Sorry. Well, the advantage of water compared with sanitation is that you don't need to convince people that they need water in the garden, that they need a well at premises. For sanitation, it takes a lot of energy. But you don't need to convince any woman in Africa that they need a well in the garden. So in that sense, it's supporting water is much easier than stimulating sanitation. And again, Ethiopia here is an example. They have self-supply, including household water treatment, now in the national policy. In the coming 5 years, they have a national policy that does include self-supply as one of the service delivery models. And that could be, again, an example for many other countries to include self-supply in their water policy models. But in many countries, self-supply is not even mentioned. So it all starts with policy on self-supply, including the water treatment issue.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Now, Arto, yeah, so one of the things I wanted to ask you is related to the CLTS point. In Finland, this isn't just about water access for these remote households. It's like all public services, healthcare, education, sanitation, electricity. There are all these other things that government has some responsibility to providing to these very remote communities. So are there any things that we can learn or understand from not just the water supply, but from other sectors as well? And any other points you wanted to make, sorry. Oh, you're muted. Unmute.
On.
Oh, there we go.
Able to take it off, yeah. First of all, I like to come back to this sanitation part, because like in Finland, the house owner is responsible for the water quality. So whatever the people, whoever is drinking that water, it has to be safe, and the responsibility is with the owner. But he doesn't have to prove it to the government. It is just embedded responsibility there in the household. If something has happened, like Chola said, if there is an epidemic coming from the household, then the government will interfere and solve that issue and like that. But when we are coming to the sanitation, or we call it here wastewater, then then this sanitation is a risk to the environment. We have a lot of lakes and we have a lot of groundwater. So we need to keep good care of that one. And now the regulation is coming to that area. Sanitation regulation is much more strict in Finland. You are not allowed to pollute the groundwater or the surface water. So that's how it is done. And in the remote areas, we have many problems because, for instance, we can take a school where the children, there are only very few children in the rural areas, and the distances are very few, and you are transporting your child to the school for 20 or 30, even 50 kilometers every day. You know, it's really a challenge. And in that sense, the government is supporting. The transport is subsidized so that you don't have to wait all the way. Another service like a postal service, we can also see it. You know, it's very difficult and to deliver the postal service in the rural areas where the houses are far, so people can collect it from the central points and such kind of things. Also, the lakes are, as I say, the lakes are our resources. So also in the fisheries, you know, we have a free to do the fishing, but there is a clear regulation that over exploiting this fishing, overusing the fish is not allowed, and that is regulated and controlled, and there is a system. Such kind of things are there, which we can maybe learn also in other parts of the world.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think this whole point about regulation and risk management is really critical, and I think that comes down to a lot of it comes down to information, and a lot of the presentations emphasize the fact that self-supply in many areas is invisible, and one of the challenges that is to Henk's proposition is that, which is kind of quite compelling, that if you invest in households to improve their own water systems, that will create multiple benefits. But from a regulator's point of view, it's a real headache, and I know this from when I used to work for the Environment Agency in the UK, that if given a choice between regulating one borehole or one wastewater treatment works rather than regulating a couple of thousand small boreholes, you're going to want to focus on the centralized thing that you can. There's a pipe coming out and you know where that pipe's going into the river, and you can regulate that. It's much cheaper and easier to regulate that than to try and keep track of hundreds, if not thousands, of small sources, which is an administrative and data headache, because your database is going to be out of date almost immediately. Now we're heading towards the end here, so I'm going to go around, I think, with the final words from each of the presenters. One of the things we haven't talked about so much is finance. Who should pay? I think this is a huge issue, and it links to personal responsibility versus government responsibility, which is, you know, a real tension all the way through this. So I'm going to I think we'll go in the order of the as they were presented. So Alana, you'll kind of wrap up words and any thoughts maybe on the financing of who should pay for self-supply to be either eliminated or supported.
And interesting, as it's supported, it will be hopefully progressively eliminated. I mean, that's, you know, part of the logic of that. I think, particularly in poorer communities. I mean, I think that the kind of critical thing is that financing mechanisms are ensured, and that governments understand they need to allocate maximum available resources, and that includes the full pot of resources available to them, which could include development grants, etc., loans and finance, as pointed out earlier, in fact, in one of the chats. And there are a range of different options in terms of smart subsidies and that sort of thing. And I think that, yeah, definitely supporting finance for upgrading beyond basic is essential, and providing the correct technical support and ensuring that technical options that are appropriate and can be managed locally are available. is a critical place for governments to invest.
Great, thank you. Arto.
Yeah, I was just working recently in another project. It was urban, and we were implementing the low-income household water connections, because most of them, they are not connected in the urban areas. So this, I consider this as part of the self-supply also, because they have no money to buy the connection fee. So how to solve the problem? We solved the problem, but that the utility gave a loan, and they are paying then this loan slowly back to the utility. And we started with the non-interest loan even, so that it was easy for them to accept and take the connection. So that the starting point was very low. There was only very small initial payment to get the connection, and then sign the agreement for the loan. So maybe the one thing also is that if you pay for your own water supply, then definitely the ownership is increasing, and ownership is directly related to the sustainability also. So in my point of view is that the owners should pay the things, but there should be such kind of loan mechanisms available which they can take the finance for.
Great, that's a great practical, pragmatic solution. Love it. Always like those. Henk.
There was one question in the box that I still would like to answer, which were the barriers of scaling up self-supply. Because if everything is so nice, why doesn't it scale up? There's many barriers, but I see three main barriers. One is the lack of awareness. Second is the lack of knowledge, and the third is lack of funds. So the lack of awareness is awareness on the potential of self-supply. People see self-supply as a threat. Take it as an opportunity. If people are willing to invest in their own systems, I mean, the government should be happy. But of course, we want to make sure that it is good quality. So that is where you need to combine it with the household water treatment. So there is a huge opportunity if you scale up self-supply, if you do it in the right way. But this is not clear to many policymakers. For instance, in this audience, I'm curious how many policymakers are in this audience. I mean, we should focus on the audience and discuss with policymakers on this topic. The next one is lack of knowledge. I mean, an example, who knows that the MS technology can make wells of 20 meters deep that cost $200? Almost nobody knows this. I mean, we need to create awareness on the innovative technologies. Another example, 15,000 rope pumps in Tanzania, in the Rwanda and Congo, no one pump. So, and that is the other one, the lack of funds. So we need funds for a large scale South-South knowledge exchange. So people from Tanzania can go to Congo and train people in Congo how to make pumps, how to drill wells. So we need money for a large-scale South-South exchange.
Yeah,
thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Chola, the last words to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. The issue of financing, actually, for me, the way I look at it is that, first of all, the financing has to be a shared responsibility, I think, between the households and governments. The reason is simple. When we are targeting big systems, government puts in money. Public financing is at play there. So in the name of equity, we must make sure that even for the small institutions, the government must find a way. They may not support directly by maybe giving money or constructing the system. They could even probably just create policies and laws that provide incentives for these small schemes. For example, you could say, if you are establishing a small scheme or a self-supply system, you are going to get maybe certain products, less of taxes or things like that, that will support to finance that particular scheme. Because at the end of the day, you are doing that work to support the overall objective of government. What I see is that there's a lot of iniquity, because when we talk about self-supply, then everybody says, well, it's the household that should finance. But when we talk about big systems, the government will actually go out of their way to borrow money to go and put up these systems, and they will pay back. And yet, in most cases, for example, if you look at sanitation, those systems will actually benefit a very small number of the population. The majority are on self-supply, and they don't get to benefit from that. So for me, I feel like government should find its place in financing these self-systems, and they must be creative about it. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Well, I think that was a fantastic summary of this whole webinar. So thank you so much for that. It was absolutely spot on. Yeah, I'd just like to really thank the team at Water Integrity Network for organizing and hosting this webinar and picking this topic. It's been a really great examples from all over the world, which has been lovely. Really great speakers, very, very clear. Great audience participation, very active discussion going on in the chat. So just thanks to all of you for participating and being part of this, and do continue the discussion on our self-supply group and through the Water Integrity Network. And we will continue to work in this direction to make sure that this issue, these practical ideas and other ideas that you have in the audience are taken forward and acted on, and we start to see the results we want to see. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.